So if you could just like break down who this Kierkegaard was. I've heard a little bit about him.
Kierkegaard is widely considered to be the father of existentialism, but this is sort of odd because many of his successors, many people that sort of took up the mantle after his philosophical term had ended, were not of the same sort of existentialism that he developed. Kierkegaard was a very passionate Christian. He was very concerned about world historical and collectivist movements that were gathering at the time of his writing. He was also concerned about how Christianity had become ossified and colorless during his own time, and he saw a public that was marked by a lot of hysteria and despair and fear and anxiety, and he felt like he wanted to reintroduce different sorts of existential views to the public and Christianity to the public in order that he may be able to help individuals develop more passion, what is known as subjectivity in his life, which is a very complex word that consists of things like freedom and overcoming despair and anxiety. There's a great sort of debate about what exactly he meant by that, by subjectivity. But ultimately what Kierkegaard is very concerned with during his time, and I think it's still very relevant for today, is how to develop a self that is rich with meaning and that one that I guess has happiness in some way, that has been liberated from the shackles of emotional pain and depression. So that's also part of the reason why he doesn't really have a home in modern philosophy, is that he sometimes writes very poetically in order to sort of convey philosophical points he thinks that cannot be conveyed directly. And he also takes up issues that might seem more like psychotherapy to us today. And he sort of blurs a lot of lines, you know. Was he a poet? Was he a philosopher? Was he a psychologist? Was he all of these things? I think he was all of them. But I think that's kind of what it means to be a philosopher, is you're a lover of wisdom, you're a lover of all things. I don't think it was always the case where we had such specialization. That sort of came later and was more of a modern phenomenon. So, but what I want to specifically talk about at the conference is, I guess I want to give a little bit of an overview, right? He has these different existential stages that people evolve out of and develop into as they sort of go on their journey towards selfhood. But specifically, I want to hone in on what he conceived to be the ethical stage of existence. So I want to talk a little bit about that, and then I think I'll ultimately sort of want to relate it to some of the conference themes that will be in play on February 28th.
And what, you mentioned these themes earlier, community,
yes,
diversity, and social justice.
What I need to do is sort of briefly sketch what I think Kierkegaard thought ethical existence to be. And this is like by no means uncontroversial. Why is there such this dispute about what Kierkegaard really thought about ethics? And there's sort of this conception, whether it's a misconception or not, I believe it is a misconception, that he's largely thought of as a Kantian ethicist, meaning that he's sort of obsessed with duty and sort of these very complicated deontological laws and whatnot. But I actually see him as being a much more flexible and malleable sort of ethical theorist. And see, when I read him, I seem to pick up on themes that are Aristotelian in nature and virtue theory, and I see divine command theory in his ethical writing, and I see noetic moral sense. I even see utilitarian consequentialist viewpoints that he at times rails against, but seem to win out when ethical principles collide. And the other problem that why people don't necessarily think that he had, that he was a Kantian ethicist, is that once one made, in his view, the ultimate existential transcendence, and that is sort of a leap into Christian faith, that there's a new sort of ethical paradigm that came about. And I think there's some truth to that, but I think there's probably a first ethics and a second ethics, and what I want to gear my talk for at this conference will be primarily the first ethics, the one that seems multifarious in nature, and related to those conference themes. I guess I should say just a little bit more about subjective ethical existence for Kierkegaard. I think it's important to understand the conception of self that he's working off of before one becomes an ethical being. And what he thinks is that ultimately man is a synthesis of the temporal and the eternal, the temporal being sort of basic contingency and immediacy, something that we find ourselves thrown into, and then sort of the eternal, these abstract ethical ideas that we can apprehend that speak to the noble character of man. And I think he sees a great deal of humanity being unable to get these two components of self together and being able to sort of transcend out of the woe and whim of oscillating aesthetic life. But if that is actually possible, I think what he thinks is that in order to marry those temporal and eternal parts, it requires sort of an apprehension of this multifarious ethical. And I think it's so multifarious that you have to call it unknowable. And so the question then becomes, well, why does he speak about it in so many ways? Why is it so unknowable? And I think there's something, Kierkegaard recognized that there was something great about the uncertainty of not knowing what it means to be an ethical person in every single context. It meant that there was no real escape route. There wasn't a professional ethicist like me or somebody else that could just say, here's the rule book for everything in life. You do this and you'll have it figured out perfectly. Or that it was something that only the greatest minds and intellects had access to. This is really egalitarian. Every individual, regardless of station or intellect in life, really should have the ability to access these things. And because it's ultimately unknowable, we can each only sort of get a glimpse of the ethical. It means that we have to do the heavy lifting for ourselves. We can't outsource it. And when we resolve to take on particular ethical viewpoints in our lives, whatever the station may be, there's a return upon the self. I think what he thinks is there is a liberation from the oscillating pleasures of aesthetic experience. There's a sense of autonomy and dignity because we feel like we've brought ourselves in alignment with eternal ideals. But he also thinks as much as we leave behind the frustration that having our life being determined by things that are external to us, that there is a new form of despair that we encounter in ethical life. The fact that we don't live up to the ethical example perfectly that we've tried to instantiate, and that guilt that sort of sits with us. And also, perhaps we become a little too infatuated with ourselves. We think that we admire the selves that we've made as ethical creatures, and perhaps we don't recognize that there could be something greater that we need to embrace rather than our own creativity in the ethical realm.
So how would it apply to the
well, it's
community?
Community, I think Kierkegaard was not an obvious communitarian. I think he fought against a lot of it. I think what he was really concerned about was that if one took one's marching orders from world historical movements about how one ought to do and what contribution society ought to be, that the individual life would be swallowed up in the pursuit of some far-off utopic idea that may never happen. That would encourage an individual to take more of an objective posture and care less and less about their life, and in that way sort of be swept away into existence.
Kind of being like a slave to the system.
Exactly. Now you may think that system is righteous and one that ought to be instituted, but there's no guarantee that all of your efforts will ultimately come to be. That doesn't mean, though, that Kierkegaard doesn't have some sort of indirect positive effect on community. If you can get people to be interested enough in their own sort of ethical existence or subjective existence and what it can do for them, then I do think that is sort of the indirect outcome that this serious undertaking will obviously elevate communitarian standards. That I think it will sort of naturally pour over, that people treat each other with more respect, and what societal ills we find today might not be there tomorrow if you just got people to take their own lives more seriously.
So if you polish yourself off, it'll reflect on other people.
Precisely. And I'll just say this real quick about diversity. Every individual can be united and be sort of edited finally against this sort of unknowable ethical, even if we do it in different ways as a result of where we are in our lives. But through that unity, there's also diversity preserved. You don't have to become a proletariat or a revolutionary or a Kantian or whatever else. Not everybody has to be the same. We're different ethical codes, I think what he's trying to say, are going to be in play for us in our firm commitment to the ethical. It's almost like in the commitment to the ethical, there's different sort of ethical theories that we have access to as we sort of go through our lives, whether we're cobbling shoes or cobbling trees. We can sort of maintain who we are as ethical beings in the roles that we find ourselves within society. That doesn't mean we have to stay there or that we should be content with them, but so far, it doesn't mean that everybody has to become the same thing. So diversity is preserved. Now on to the question about social justice, and again, Kierkegaard, I don't think was too attentive to this. I think it's something that was more of a product of the 20th century. But social justice, I think, is typically this broad sort of notion that ultimately we're going to take sort of political and economic postures to rectify past identities. And I think Kierkegaard would find something sort of problematic about national sort of global efforts to do that. Because I think for him, again, it's sort of turning individuals into aggregates or groups or whatnot, not really recognizing their individuality. But that's not to say that there isn't a role for social justice as a potential component of this multifarious ethical. That presumably, if you do think that individuals need to be moved up in society or promoted and stuff like that, you can honor. I think that might be a reasonable ethical theory that's available to you as you deal with one in an individual encounter. But to shift people around as if they're sort of pieces to a strategy board or something like that, I think he would find something dehumanizing about that, even though it's very well intentioned.
Right.
But I think he's worried that that sort of thinking will again ultimately uphold this idea that the individual isn't worth that much. So, yeah.
It's a lot of information that I have to sit back and work out in my head. But it's all very interesting, and it's been great to have you on the show. I'm getting a little message from my producer here that we're about out of time.
Well, I really appreciate you having me on.
But yeah, I'd love to sit and chit chat with you about it a little bit more.
Most definitely.
And look forward to having you on again.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Luke Johnson, everybody.
Right on.